And we're recording. All right, so this is session 2 of our conversation we just had with Tim Staten, and wanted to chat more about, actually I wanted to chat a little bit more about MAiD, Bill C-7, but also highlight your new book. And congratulations on the book, by the way.
Yeah, thanks so much.
That's exciting. Could you talk a little bit more about what the book is and yeah, just what it's about?
Yeah, happy to. And actually, so it released in the US on the 1st of March and in Canada on the 2nd. But my first advanced copy got stuck in the mail. So I actually just got one today, and it's really exciting as anyone who out there who spent a lot of time and work on something to see something take physical form, right? And so when it arrived today with FedEx, I was very excited. And this is a culmination of many years of work. So as I mentioned in the previous interview, I've been working with Christian Horizons, a nonprofit faith-based organization serving people with intellectual and developmental disabilities for just about 15 years now. And I was drawn to that out of philosophy as a way to kind of make real some of the things that I was learning about. So I found it all very fascinating, all of the ways that people have thought about what is right and what is good and what is a life of flourishing over the centuries. But um, that doesn't do a lot of good if you're not willing to make it real somehow. And so in working with Christian Horizons, it started out as this probably a grandiose, more charity perspective on my part, that it would be really neat to be in a world where I can make a difference in people's lives. And I did not know much about intellectual and developmental disability at the time, but as I entered into that world and as I met people who lived with intellectual and developmental disabilities, Canadian citizens, many of whom had been institutionalized for many years before and were just now coming out into community settings. It's profound, and if you haven't had that experience, if someone out there has not gotten to know people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, then I really do encourage you to find a space in your life to forge friendships and to connect with that community. And I think, as happens whenever we experience life with people who are different from us in some way, our imagination is expanded for the possibility of what it means to be human and the possibility of what it means to live a flourishing life. Because often we're sold a certain story, right? That if you want to live a good life, you need to be a good kid, work hard, go to college and university, get a good job, make lots of money, have a family. There's this um, there's this whole worldview that's kind of sold to us. But as you get to know people in different situations, you realize that how diverse a flourishing life can be. And that being said, I mean, we were just having some conversations around MAiD and Bill C-7. That being said, we have so much work to do on our social systems in Canada and our health systems in Canada to make sure that everyone can live a life that is flourishing and good.
It's
Especially,
quite
I would say, yeah, go ahead, Mark.
it's
Sorry.
quite daunting about the mountain
Yeah.
to get to that place. Um, One thing that I didn't get to mention within the other interview was what I considered in terms of the debates. We have a bunch of politicians that are not educated or experts in disability studies, or uh, we didn't even have race analysis about what's going on with MAiD
Mm-hmm.
and how that affects marginalized individuals. And I find that problematic. I feel like these are things that would be obvious to people that either live with these, live that experience, or know people that are around that. So I found that uh, problematic, but at the same time, people have said, this has technically been debated for more than, we're going on 20 years, right? But still, I think it's one thing to hear and there's one thing to understand. And there's a type of this lived experience where you do have a sort of knowledge about what's going on. And like, just practically, I actually don't know whether or not utilitarian, like there's an assumption that utilitarianism is the predominant ethical theory within bioethics. But when I talked to Udo, he said he's a minority. So like, I
Right.
actually don't know what the data is on that.
Yeah.
And when I looked at David Chalmers, he did it with other people, obviously. Phil Paper's survey on philosophy, deontologists are the popular one. But that was in 2015, so maybe I may have got that date wrong, but it was old. There was a new survey out on philosophers. But the thing is, just because you make a wide net on philosophers doesn't mean that you're doing a, you know, what exactly is the prevailing theory in bioethics, right? Like, you could be
Yeah.
talking to a philosopher of fiction or a philosopher of epistemology, whatever. They have these ethical theories, but then, like, what exactly is happening in bioethics? And then you get it down to the geography as well, not just American, Germany, or Netherlands or whatever. It's like, well, what's happening in Canadian bioethics? And then how does that fit in with critical race theory, disability studies? I find like that's unfortunate we don't have that data, but I find like that would be useful, because I think there's this assumption that there's utilitarians, and I don't know if that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, you're touching on so many different things there. One is philosophy and philosophers and self-perception, right? And I've done some work on this in terms of like Aristotle and Plato and some Christian theologians as well, that looks at what is happiness, right? And how much philosophers are tempted to see the intellectual pursuit as like the the primary happiness that people can experience. But that makes perfect sense if you're a philosopher, and that's the world that you're in, and that's the greatest moments that have been in these intellectual pursuits. That doesn't necessarily mean that in humanity that we can stack that up against other people's experiences of happiness, right? Even if they construct these great elaborate arguments for it. And so I think there's a big difference between philosophers and predominant philosophies of the day, or even bioethics of the day, and these kinds of systematic approaches, or whether people would say, yeah, I'm a utilitarian, or I'm a deontologist, or whatever, and deontologist. And there's a big difference between saying you're that and having those values influence how you act, right? And
Right.
so I think that's more the challenge, is that, as Tim was talking about neoliberalism and some of the factors that shape our healthcare dynamics. Yeah, we want to believe in Canada that we offer best healthcare for everyone, right? And it's an equal and equitable approach. We know that's not the reality, and at the end of the day, what are some of those factors that actually influence people's decision making? It's not likely that they're going to say, well, I'm well versed in utilitarianism and I made the choice to maximize happiness for the greatest number of people. Or no, it's like, well, we only had this number of vaccines and we had to choose those who got them, right? And or we had to maximize the dollar funding that we had, and we had to decide who was going to receive that. And so I think that's the challenge of applying philosophy, is it's not necessarily going to be in these systematic ways.
Oh, sorry about that. One thing that I find troublesome with this, both sides of the debate, is like, I don't see a middle ground, but like I sort of see one if certain things are accepted. For example, from my understanding, from the people that I've talked to, this isn't really a big debate of whether or not we have enough support. Like, pharmacare is being debated in Canada, and there's people that are not even they can't even get medicine, even though there's certain medicines that they can't afford. And we see one thing that I haven't addressed is ageism within the medical field as well. um I was just reading an article about Sir Anthony Hopkins, and there's an assumption that I'm 35, that somehow my life would somehow be more of value than, say, him, and yet he's probably going to make 5 more movies before I go. Like the is it's like, well, why do we have that assumption? Just because someone's older, they're less, and that makes no sense to me. And I think there may have been some cultural influences on that, and some generational influences, because I know certain cultures uh, hold elderly people to esteem and as wise people, but I feel yeah, certain places don't, um, and that will make a person feel like a burden to their family, to their society, on the system. And I find that very unfortunate, um, because I was talking to a friend about wanting MAiD. She had a family member commit suicide, and this is one of the things that I'm scared of, is that if we not allow it, I feel like there's going to be deaths either way, on disabled lives, and the thing is that there are people that are disabled that want to go, and they're suffering for such a long time, that if they don't have the option, in this particular case with my friend, the person took it on themselves to do, if they're in excruciating pain, and that really makes me sad. Like, I know another friend who had to clean up after it was their father that took their life. And if there's like, it's like, this is the cost of limiting access to this service, that uh, if their death was foreseeable, then they would have had a dignified death. But because it's not, they don't get this access. But at the same time, if they do get access and the safeguards are not in place, then you have a whole bunch of people that are going to be at risk of being able to kill themselves than get medical care, right? And I don't know, I'm just seeing tragic deaths on both sides. And I feel like,
Yeah.
as a legislator, you would want to um, have as many safeguards as possible, make it as, iron tight as possible. And if someone was to push people to kill themselves, then, have criminal charges placed on them. We do that with abortion doctors, because I think he brought up abortion at the same time. People have been saying, people will abuse this service, and doctors who have done late term abortions, or even, after they were born, uh, people are like, this is a terrible thing. And yeah, it is terrible, and we've criminally charged them. And I feel like this would have been a case where, for example, the people that are pushing Foley to kill himself, like that shouldn't be allowed, right? Like, that should be, there should be safeguards in place for that.
Right. I mean, so maybe I'll just stop you there for a second, because there's so many, I think, important things that you're touching on here. Yeah. So there's a lot of questions. I mean, one thing, I'm reading a great book by Brian Brock. It's I'll hold this up as well. It's Wondrously Wounded, but he has a son with Down syndrome, and so that's, I think, what we were talking about before was specifically
Yeah.
disability selective abortions, right? And so he talks about his and his wife's journey through the medical profession, and just how much pressure is on them um, to get tested, to test before that kind of point of no return passes for them, where they were in Germany, and the pressure to do it because they could terminate that that birth before it took place, right? And so what he's saying, because you mentioned that some doctors should be prosecuted, and whether it's an end of life case or a like a before birth case, yeah, but that's a one hard line, right? And he actually, I don't know if I can find it here, but he actually has a great line about, that's not the way that our society works these days. It doesn't work with the saying no, the prohibitions. It works with the idea of norms. So what are the expected norms that we're working with? So he's talking about biopolitics here, He says, modern democracies can be called biopolitical to the extent that the routines of governance do not repress, but aim to foster and augment the forces of human life. He said, high modern accounts of moral and legal norms understood as forbidding or prohibiting certain actions through pres- sorry, prescribing injunctions such as one should not lie or stealing is illegal. So he's saying that used to be that we would have these really black and white laws, right? And then you would prosecute if somebody crossed the line. But he says today norms work differently. Neoliberal societies priding themselves in the freedom they allow their citizens, simply forbidding actions and suppressing infractions by force draws too much attention to the limits of freedoms. Lighter touch norms preserve the illusion of citizens' freedom being essentially untrampled. And so we got into that a bit with what is autonomy before. But the challenge is that there are so many like paper cuts along the way. It's not just like somebody comes along and does a grievous rip of the page or whatever you want, however you want to describe it. Yes, there are those cases, and yes, they should be prosecuted, and we have laws for that. But what do you do about all the things up until that point? And you were talking about ageism, for example. So it can apply to racism or ageism or ableism, any of these isms, where what about all of those, you might call them microaggressions, right? All of those little things along the way that that can be seen as pressuring, can be argued to be pressuring, or that are can be argued to not be. And so that's why it's a much bigger issue than just making sure that we set up safeguards, because they're not going to, the legislators are not going to solve ableism. And I think, like you were saying before, probably aren't even necessarily equipped in some of these conversations, whether it's some of the deeper philosophical conversations or or some of the conversations that are happening in disability studies either.
In a society with such like, because it was kind of assumed, just in the tone, that this is a neoliberal view, and I don't know if it was kind of scoffed at, but it, like, if I mean, if this is a view that's neoliberal, and people have this view, then how do you determine, like, how do you rectify all these different views and respect people's rights at the same time? Like, for me, I don't understand why we can't do both, but we allow people to have that freedom, but also address racism, ageism, uh, sexism, and age, all this stuff, because
Mhm.
those systems are not going to go away. Like racism is, that hasn't been gone for, that's not going to be gone for a while. And but at the same time, you can't limit um certain health practices based on that until we have a society that's not racist, that's not ageist, that's not ableist. Then we can offer this. That doesn't sound like, I don't know where the threshold would be where we'd be like, okay, now we can do this.
Right. So, and I think that's why we have to ask the question, why have we reached a threshold where disabled people can can take their lives or be assisted in taking their life, and other marginalized groups, other stigmatized groups, we're not approaching it that way, right? We've already talked about how disability is much more than a physical impairment or that sort of thing. It's a whole constellation of issues within our society that is going to cause suffering and misfortune in someone's lives. But if other people are facing these same kind of constellation of issues and um, in areas of marginalization, we don't add an exception to a medical assistance in dying bill, right? And so I think that's an excellent question. What is the threshold that we've crossed now, that sets this group apart? And is that something that is really supported, like you were saying, by the all of the work and research and views that have kind of gone into this work.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's been informed.
Yeah, exactly.
And that, yeah, that's concerning. So like, yeah, I'm still I just I don't know, like the only thing that I can see, I don't know what's going to happen. I think they have an extension now in for the bill. Um but I feel like, you know, at some point, like I was like they won't when I was debating this, they're like, well, if your sole condition is mental illness, it will not be applied to you. Um, and I was sort of going off of that, and then they changed it like last week or 2 weeks ago. So like I have no idea what the bill is going to look like in a few more weeks. Um, but I am leaning towards allowing access because of uh, what I see is just like I feel like both of them should be worked on. I don't think it should be either or. Um, it just like that either or thing. That's what I'm hearing. Like I don't know any, at least from the vocal disability rights activists and organizations, that they want MAiD and that they want better legislation for MAiD. I haven't seen that commentary yet. It sounds like a complete prohibition on it, from what I've been reading. Is that the type of vibe you're getting?
No, I mean, and I understand how that can be, how that can come across, and understandably, there are diverse views on that as well. If you're talking about whether people supported MAiD from the beginning or not. I mean, I'm someone coming from the Christian faith, and just personally, I would not be a proponent of MAiD legislation, but that's speaking for me. For disability rights organizations or disability advocacy organizations, from what I've heard, for the most part, and you might be reading different things than I, it is very much focused on this particular issue of why, or there's a hashtag, right? Why us? Why is disability something that's singled out as making life less worth living, or being and again, we don't want to underestimate the amount of suffering that anyone goes through, whether that's for mental health reasons, whether that's for disability, health complications out of disability, those types of things, or whether it's the existential suffering of people facing stigma and marginalization and all of those kinds of questions. Um, right? The young people facing discrimination or harassment in school settings, what have you. Like, I don't think it's a matter of oppression Olympics where we want to say that somebody's suffering is such that this particular group of people um, should be offered the the, that kind of a solution uh, for systems that need to be addressed, and for cultural attitudes that need to be addressed, and those kinds of questions.
Yeah, one thing that you brought up that I really liked was not necessarily that people are like, there are cases where people are afraid of the prospect of suffering, where the specter of death and suffering is around the corner and they want to, you know, go before that happens. One thing, but that in particular is, how do we philosophically define what is a life worth living? And I had a conversation with someone who said, you know, if I couldn't contribute to society, I wouldn't,
Right.
you know, this would make my value of life go down. And I found that startling. That we sort of, I asked them, I said, hey, where did you come up with that belief that you have to
Mm-hmm.
produce to be of value? And how does that affect other people? Like if a disabled person was to say that, how would you say that? How would you view that interaction, and what would you say to a person like that? And if you would say something different to a person that doesn't produce as much as you do, then why do you say to yourself, like, where did that value come from? And I think
Right.
these values need to be evaluated. Why do we have to you know, have like, I'd be of more value if I was out I don't know, working with a ton of organizations and producing a lot of capital or whatever. And I don't think the value of life should be determined that way.
And yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
no, I think those are really important questions. And again, I mean, one of the things I touch on in my book is that so much of this isn't things that we have consciously thought through and come to a rational decision that, oh yeah, I've evaluated my whole philosophical framework and I've come to this conclusion based on understanding all of the philosophies of the world. No, I mean, none of us are in that place. All of us are in this place of like, who am I, and kind of clinging to those answers and those solutions often that are presented to us in our life. And often our value comes from those around us, even if we don't necessarily acknowledge that, right? And I think that's part of the challenge, is that um, so much of our society is based around this like get kind of a valuation. And so it's understandable when you're talking about like what is human dignity, and the Cardis organization has done some good work around this. But when you're asking the question about what is human dignity, why is it that we see some of these basic um, bodily realities of people as being undignified? So whether it's somebody who drools or somebody who walks a little bit differently, I mean, you see it even when our political leaders stumble or stutter, or these types of things that we like to think of ourselves as an enlightened society, or in the US, and but as soon as something like that happens, we jump on the ridicule train,
Yeah.
right? And so what are those, I think, like you're saying, what are those values that drive what it looks like to contribute and what it looks like to be a valued member of society? And actually, it dovetails with the question of justice here a bit too. And Derrida gets into this, that how can I truly respond to the calls of justice? And I think you were talking too about joining these different organizations and making a difference in the world. And absolutely, those are good things to do. But if you want to view it as the standard of justice or the standard of production, then you're never going to achieve it. You're never going to achieve justice for everyone in this world. And so if you're just measuring yourself up against what needs to be done, then we're always all going to be inadequate, right?
Yeah,
And so
exactly. Yeah.
we need a whole different framework. And I think if you're looking at it in argument terms, it would be a reductio ad absurdum, right? That it's just not sustainable to view our own value in light of who is the better achiever, who is the better producer. And so that in itself kind of disproves some of these modern notions. And you were saying before about how many cultures will look to elders for their wisdom, for their expertise. We have to ask ourselves, why are we in a place right now that is not a reality for us, right? That we see these grievous situations in long-term care homes, nursing homes, those types of things. And it's not that I mean, I'm sure in some places it's that the workers are not looking out for people's best interests, but let's be honest, as a society, we've failed many people who have been kind of decreed as not valuable enough. And we might not come out and say that, but I think its ripples effects are felt through all of our systems.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything that you wanted to wrap up with?
Well, Siri often chimes in here right at this moment, but no, I guess I want to thank you for sure for having these conversations. I mean, I think part of the challenge is just where we're at as a society in general with being able to have difficult conversations well, whether that's on social media, whether that's in these kinds of talks. It's difficult to ever get to something substantive around these questions of what is dignity, what is value, what framework are people coming from. And so I've always appreciated your inquiring mind and your ability to ask questions around those things. And so it's certainly been fun to dig into some of that today.
Thanks, Keith. I appreciate that. And I'm looking forward to reading your book, and congrats again.
Awesome. Thanks so much,
All
Brian.
right. Take care. Have a good day.
You too.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.